Good afternoon, everybody. This is Connie Chan Robinson, Executive Director for the Center for Collaborative Planning with the Public Health Institute, and we're delighted that we can spend a little bit of time this afternoon with all of you. I'm joined by my colleague, Joan Twist, the Executive Director for the Center for Civic Partnerships, also with PHI, and we have certainly been honored to have been able to partner with Joan and her team at the center to hold a series of capacity building events around increasing your sustainability odds. So thank you for joining us this afternoon. We have a lot in store and hopefully an opportunity in the middle as well as sort of towards the end for some open communication and dialogue and problem solving around some questions that we might collectively have around this real work, hard work around sustainability. So again, thank you all. Just in terms of how we got here, this is a follow-up event based on the two trainings that we have been hosting, one in Burbank and also another in Sacramento, that really kind of focused on some of the planning and processes and tools around sustainability, as well as a little of a dive in terms of how do we think about policy development and community engagement as a part of the overall work around sustaining kind of our organizations and the important work that certainly all of you do. So this is in follow-up to those in-person trainings. This was very limited, if you will, to the participants from those trainings as an opportunity to do a deeper dive on some of the objectives and conversations that we had during those trainings. We also understand that some of you may be bringing on board a few additional staff or other people within your organization and networks to join us this afternoon. And so some of the things that we're going to cover today may be sort of refreshers from the training so that we establish some common base of understanding and laying a solid foundation of groundwork before we sort of take the deeper dive. Just in terms of some quick housekeeping before I turn it over to Joan to get us started, we are recording this webinar and all lines are muted, so there will be occasions where we will certainly invite all of you to join in on some questions and do some interactive engagement with you all, but all lines are muted. The recording and the presentation slides will be available after the webinar. You will receive a link from us that will contain the links and information about both the recording and the slide deck, as well as hopefully invite you to help us evaluate this webinar. So there will be a follow-up survey that we invite you again to kind of help us assess kind of the takeaways and what worked for you and what potentially didn't, so that we can continue to improve. And then just in terms of how we're going to engage in the Q&A process, we will be asking everyone to submit Q&A via the chat feature, which if you look on your screen, up on the right-hand corner, you'll see hopefully a chat button with a little bubble there. You can send your questions, and please send your questions to everyone so that we can see each other's questions. And you would type your question in the box as noted on this graphic and this illustration. Again, it's very important that you send the questions to everyone so that we're aware of the kinds of questions during our Q&A session. With that in mind, without further ado, I'm going to invite my friend and colleague, Joan Twist, to get us started.
Thanks so much, Connie. Really appreciate it. We are going to start out with what our goals are for today's session, and they derive from a couple of things, largely from the results from the SurveyMonkey, and hopefully all of you did that, and we really appreciate it because it really helps us narrow down with the amount of time we have to focus on things that are of most interest to you. And so you'll see that we want to provide this opportunity for greater depth into the critical steps explore some ideas for making it a priority among multiple stakeholders, and then have time to look at and consider some alternatives for fund development. And that last one is the one that Connie has spent some time putting some slides together for. And then another area that came up was putting together the justification statement. So basically we had folks that had shared the information with staff, but then they were not able to get back to the material. And I guess I want to say it's okay. You're on the call now, and you can make a new plan. I think tomorrow is the first day of spring, so we don't have to worry about, what didn't happen in the first quarter. We can go from here. And the important thing, like everything else, is getting started. And so you're taking that first step, and we will support you with some ideas for that today. So folks wanted a review of the steps. They wanted more information on how to define sustainability, so we're going to go over that, talk about the committee, and then talk about getting the board on board. And that was both a combination of the SurveyMonkey, but also what we culled from the evaluations. So let's dive in. So these are the 10 steps that were presented in the training, and that are sort of a very logical way to kind of work through this process. It's not the only way, and I'll be talking about that. So as you recall, those of you who were on the training, we started out with the idea of creating a shared understanding, the plan to plan, which is your organizational effort, positioning the effort. We actually did an exercise on that, as you recall. It was a checklist, and you said what you were doing and what you still needed to do. Reviewing the current picture, which we also talked about. That's sort of the first sort of laying out on a grid what you're doing. And then we also took quite a bit of time in the training to go over step 5, which was developing the criteria upon which you're going to make decisions about what to keep, what to go after or not. Step 6 is then, when you have done these first few things, to decide what it is you're going to do, create some options, and then develop, implement, and evaluate the plan. So some of these, especially the last 3, can't really be done in a training. So what we do is highlight and shine a spotlight on them, but at the same time, they're things that are gestational and organic to your particular situation. So sort of backing up just a little bit from the steps themselves, the important thing is that we're wanting to really inculcate a philosophy of sustainability thinking and having that be really included in all aspects of your work, from program development, marketing, communications, all the way through to evaluation. Now, it's fine if you're at a point, because things happen in the life of every organization where you may need to do some very immediate sustainability planning, and that's a reality, and we're not in any way discounting that. But there are pieces of this process that really should be very familiar to you, because they should be included in all of your practices as a fully functioning organization that is mission-driven. Philanthropy and corporate investments are looking to see this. So there really are just good basic steps here. It's just one process, though, and sustainability can take many forms. So you may need to create a roadmap that works best for you. It's very similar to strategic planning in that there's the development of it, there's the execution, and there's the evaluation. It does not have to be as linear as this is laid out. And again, you probably recall I said that quite a bit in the training. Some of these things can be done as a standalone, or it may be that you already have pieces that neatly fit in to these different steps that you can integrate into the process. So we see the approach and the tools being very useful when new players come into the process, especially if you're talking about this as part of a coalition collaborative review. If you have an opportunity to press the pause button and see where you want to go next, it invites a conversation that is very transparent. And if, unfortunately, there's a resource instability that occurs, it allows you to regroup in light of that, or you may have a change in staff capacity, which could also cause you to want to reflect and do this. So let's take a little bit of time on step one in terms of creating that shared understanding. Sustainability is really a buzzword. We use it, we see it all the time, and if you Google it, you'll get all the green sustainability stuff, which is great, but it's really not what we're talking about here. But what is important is that there's a definition, there's a common definition for the use of the term so that the future planning efforts are guided by a common vision. So one of the things you can do is, just as an exercise to sort of start getting people on the same page, is ask them, when you think about sustainability, what does it mean to you? What does it represent? And have, Post-its and a sticky wall and, do something graphically. You want to think about creating an atmosphere of fun and of hope. And because there are a lot of people that will be panicked when they hear the word sustainability. They'll think maybe this is about really a big problem in the organization, and I don't think that that's really where you want to be. The definition can be narrow or it can be very broad. The important thing is that it's shared and it's mutually agreed upon. It can mean sustaining a group, sustaining a particular effort, or, as we'll talk about in a minute, benefits to the community at large, and that's sort of a bigger one. One of the things that we do, and you remember we did in the training, is we did 3 polls, and those polls they come out of something in the toolkit that's a 5-item quiz, and it's a good way to sort of start the conversation, and the important thing is to get everyone on the same page. So you remember this is an example of one of them. So a successful sustainability effort can lead to continued health and quality of life benefits over time for a community. It can lead to continuation of a program, changes in policy or system, or an increase in community capacity. And I'm sure you all remember that the correct answer is any or all of the above. It doesn't necessarily, though, mean continuation of a particular program because, as we know and we talked about, and Connie took us through an exercise where a policy change can certainly ensure sustainability. Now, as a center, we decided that a definition that we thought was most beneficial to the field was one which is the first one, response A, continued health or quality of life benefits for a community over time, because we think that that is the most mission-oriented and allows for many, many different streams to lead to where you want to go. If you say, well, we're always going to continue this program, that's probably a little bit unrealistic in most cases. I'm not saying that in times it won't work, but in general, programs have their heyday, and they need to then morph and be flexible over time. And so when we say the benefits in the community, we're using that within the context of a very broad definition of health improvement, which includes the social determinants of health, education, employment, housing, as well as the more traditional healthcare, public health improvements. One of the things that you'll see is that people sometimes equate sustainability with institutionalization. And while that is a perfectly fine goal in some situations, what that really means is it's integrated into an organization or an agency. When we're talking about sustainability, it's conceptually a broader concept. It's not just about institutionalizing it. It's really looking at how is the work we're doing making it sounds very altruistic, but making the world a better place, and then how do we continue to see where we fit into that vision over time. But it's really important to be flexible. We know that that's critical to survival. So let me give you an example of this is a real-life sustainability definition. It's from a community family resource center. There was a collaborative that was founded in 1994, and it came about because of 2 large multi-year grants from Children and Family Commission and a local funder. The functions initially were to have resource and referral for child care and to house a free clinic for children and families. But by 2000, the mission had expanded, and the activities concomitant with that also broadened to include facilitated playgroups and parent education. So in time, what happened was they transitioned the referral function to another organization and moved to the clinic, which left them with the core piece that then became somewhat threatened because the Children and Family Commission went a different direction towards obesity prevention, and the local foundation had a decrease in its corpus in terms of funding. So the definition as they went through the sustainability process was the continuation of community family resource centers, programs, and services means that families have access to resources and information that empower them to support their children's early care and education needs and allow children and families to be healthy and thrive within our community. What you'll note in there is it doesn't talk about the specific programs. It talks about and it answers the question, and this is the important question you want to ask in terms of development of your definition. If the Community Family Resource Center programs and services were successful, how would the community be different or better? So that's sort of you plug in your organization. If XYZ organization was successful, how would the community or population of interest be different or better? That's your prompting question to come to your definition. So let's look at a second one. This is a different set of circumstances, and we'll return to this scenario later in the presentation. I think it's really important, and this is this whole piece of setting the stage so you don't have people coming in with a lot of anxiety about, oh, this really is about a reduction in force, or this really is about my program or my job is going to be cut. The reality is, in some cases, that may, in fact, be an element of what, I'm not going to sugarcoat it, that may be what has to happen, but it isn't always. And so that gets back to why it's so important to have a sustainability frame as part of your organizational philosophy and MO, if you will. So in this case, it's a different set of circumstances. It's a growth model versus retrenchment. So there's a school-based garden. It's very successful. It catches the attention of media and the school board. The high school administration gets essentially approached to start growing their partnerships, not just their garden. They decide they're going to couple the experiential component of doing the gardening with curriculum development, the regional occupational program, and a long-term goal of business development to make it financially sustainable over time. They involve the high school students in the planning. The high school secures additional resources. It expands what was actually grown through the garden. A non-for-profit partner is brought in to secure and manage the grant funding, and the collaboration that was formed from the partnership encouraged the group to further develop their entrepreneurial focus for long-term sustainability. So again, their definition is the continuation of the high school gardening program means the ongoing promotion of academic excellence and contribution to the local economy. Again, the broader you make your definition, the more players, stakeholders, partners, and financial interests and investors you can bring in. So that's kind of the step one, sort of really starting out on good solid footing. This next step is the plan to plan. So whether you're going to be doing this process with just a few staff or a large collaborative, this is a basic step for all of your strategic planning, all of your planning processes, period. Because what will happen is if you try to do this as you go and doing the work, you will have people dropping off like flies, if you will, with a common refrain of, we don't have the time. And so it's very easy to get derailed if you don't do the plan to plan. The work goes more smoothly, and it increases the likelihood of accountability, follow-through, and buy-in. So the most important things to consider are the who, not the band, but the who, the coordinator, the planning group, and the facilitator. So who is coordinating? So that means someone is the point person that holds the tasks for the group. They provide the structure, they do the meeting logistics, or they work with someone to do it. They're not necessarily doing every one of these tasks, but they're ensuring that they get done, that there's internal and external communications. So someone needs to have that role. If it's just everybody's doing a piece of it, it is very likely that some ball will get dropped. The second is the who in terms of who's involved, the participants, the staff, the board members, the community stakeholders, and the volunteers. And there isn't sort of a tried and true formula for this. I think if you go through and say, okay, if this is our sustainability definition, what flows from that then is who you should have involved. One of the things we didn't do as much in the training, but I really wanted to emphasize is, and because it did come up a lot in the questions and the request for follow-up, you know, having a board member is critical. Which board member is probably up to you and up to how your committee structure is, but eventually this has to work its way up to a board at some level. And having a board member who is one of the peers of the people making perhaps the final decision, if that's the case, if it's of that high stakes import, having someone who's been through the process gives the whole process so much credibility because they're speaking from having lived it. They're not just sort of getting a document that describes what happened. The board chair would be fabulous. That's really a decision that the executive director has to make as to whether that person has the time. Certainly someone who heads up any kind of long-range planning or strategic planning committee function, all those things make really good sense in terms of a logical person. But I would say if you can possibly do it, it's going to enhance the process to do it. And to really be very open to the community stakeholder being part of the process too. I think you'll learn a lot that you maybe didn't necessarily appreciate in terms of community perspective on your work. Sometimes just learning that the community doesn't know you do X, Y, and Z is a huge eye-opener in and of itself because it tells you and directs you towards communications strategy. But you know, and if you have volunteers that are invested in the community, what better way in the program or the effort, what better way to recognize their contribution and seeing things through their eyes. So that's sort of the second who. And then the third who is different from the coordinator, but who facilitates all of these sessions is usually a period of time we'll talk about in a second where this has to happen over multiple meetings and so forth. It's important to have someone who has good facilitation skills, who can get a group to come to closure on some things. There could be a need, and that's especially in step 6 when you're making the decision, to have truly an outside person, even if they come in only for that particular discussion, because they not only need to be neutral, they need to be perceived as neutral by the group. And so that's very important. Someone could have the best heart to do this, but if the group thinks that their program or their effort is going to be protected by the fact that they're the facilitator, they will not get the kind of genuine contributions that perhaps they're trying to get. The second area is in the area of decision-making, deciding in advance. Is it going to be consensus? Will majority vote rule when consensus can't be reached? How will that play out? Is the decision that this group makes advisory or is it final? And the important piece with all of this work, and I know I said this a lot in the training, is transparency. If there is transparency, people will live with the results. That's been my experience, and I'm sure some of you on the phone, if not all of you, have had that as well. It's when things are not transparent and not clear to people that the talk at the water fountain starts, and you have a bubbling sort of descent, and that's what you want to avoid. How long it will take, that really depends. It depends on a number of factors. How complex is the effort? Is it just one event within a program, or is it all the way up to a huge, large, multi-pronged organization? How big is the group? While we encourage lots of input, you also need to decide a good size of the group for decision making. So, I would say 8 or so minimum, maybe up to 12 to 15 for sort of the decision-making body with contributions in different ways. But that really depends on what your norm and your culture is. But you really want to have an opportunity to hear from people. You don't want people just filling chairs for the sake of filling chairs. You need to set in advance what the time commitment is. So that's where this plan to plan is so important, so that you lay out in advance, this is going to take this much time. And the reason that's important is the next area has to do with access to data. There are lots of times when people start a process, they get 2 or 3 steps in, and then they realize we need a whole realm of data that we didn't think we were going to need. Some of it may be available, but it has to be accessed through databases, et cetera, different agreements with organizations to get that data. Sometimes if it has to be generated by virtue of original data collection process, that's even longer. If the time frame gets derailed and you get into, we all know we live in a cyclical world in terms of summer vacations, in terms of holidays, et cetera, and that gets derailed enough, you will lose people who will not be able to come back. So you need to be very realistic. And one of the other factors is how familiar and tech savvy is this group. So there are a lot of things that could be done online in between meetings, but you have to assume, or you have to check better, that people have access and comfort, have a certain comfort level with exchanging information or providing input over a technology platform. Ideally, we say anywhere from a year to 18 months before the, and this is important, planned ending date of a program, because we know that the planned ending date is not always what happens at the actual ending date. So, with grants being sometimes 12 to 18 months themselves, that means you're almost starting to think about sustainability right when you get the grant. I know that's a hard pill to swallow and not something that people want to think about. But again, if you've integrated this style and this orientation of thinking into all the work, then it's a whole different sort of philosophy. Group agreements like we had at the training are particularly useful for the meetings themselves to make sure you have an environment of trust. And really, this is where best practices for all the coalition committee work that you've all been in, allowing for layers of participation, being flexible when things come up, having clear roles and responsibilities, and being able to adapt. So you can expect that the first time you introduce sustainability planning, it can be difficult. There are a lot of fears and worries that people might have about it. Maybe the best thing would be to just say it stirs up a little bit of anxiety. But if it's done annually, then you don't have those issues. So those are the first 2 steps that people wanted sort of more drill down on, so that's why we're doing it. For people that are joining us for the first time, I hope that helps sort of set the stage. Going to transition now to Connie, who's going to talk specifically about fund development. Then I'm going to come back in because there was one person in particular, if not more, who had done a lot of this front work that we talked about, but had not done as much on the justification statement. So I'm going to come in again after Connie with that. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Joan. So we're going to kind of take, again, based on what Joan referenced in terms of some of the areas for the deeper dive that folks have asked for, and one of them was around the specifically fund development as it relates to sustaining your important and good outcomes that you're producing from your organizations. And so just to say at the upfront that fundraising and sort of financial sustainability is, again, one of sort of several, right, definitions or part of the whole picture around sustainability. But just to kind of get us started on this conversation, I'd like to have with you all about, what does it mean to kind of raise funds to sustain organizational outcomes? And, contrary to sort of conventional wisdom, if you will, really the purpose of fundraising is not necessarily to raise money, but in actuality, it's to really help organizations such as all of ours to manage what we might call and describe as kind of interdependencies, right, with the greater public, right? Those folks who need to be aware of the issues, need to know sort of what's going on around those issues, and what are some of the solutions that are being, that are in place, right, to address those issues and concerns. And so we want to kind of create, through the idea of fundraising, if you will, or strategy, to start creating those interdependencies with specifically that public who share our, mutual goals and objectives. So, fundraising is really not just about raising funds. And so, therefore, if we sort of, make that assumption, why not call this asking for money? Well, it's not just about asking for money. And the fact that oftentimes I think when we talk about, fund development or fundraising, as we know, there are certain sort of conversations that are kind of taboo, right, in nature oftentimes when we either talk with our friends or colleagues or even those, who we work with, right, to really produce the kind of community outcomes that we're all working towards. And those taboos have to do with politics. They have to do oftentimes with religion, certainly in terms of, sex, and then finally money is one of those key taboos that oftentimes we feel like we don't want to go there, certainly with our friends and family. So it's not just about money, but it's really about what we might call brand loyalty. In other words, really finding and connecting with those folks in the community who we have developed some connection relationship with, who understand the value of the work that we're trying to do and why we're doing it. So just a quick kind of interactive here. Here are a number of statements, and I'd love for everybody on the line to use that chat box function. And let me know as I'm sort of reading through these if any of these are, which of these are true. And so special events and grants are the keys to success. Is that true based on your experience and what you've seen others do? New contributors are the key to success. A development director will come right along and will bring in all the money we need, right, all the resources that we can possibly need and want. And finally, fundraising success is measured in dollars. So I'm going to invite you to just quickly use that chat box. Make sure to send it to everyone and just type in your answer. Are any of these true? Just spend just a few minutes doing that real quick. And hopefully everybody remembers how to use the chat functions. Okay, I'm not seeing any of the input on the Q&A. Oh, not true, from Catherine Ray, ×4. Okay. 1 is true, and maybe number 2. Okay. Okay, well, let's use these for the purposes of a quick kind of conversation here. So 1, and then we have Hannah who typed in all 4 are false. So let's take a look at these real quickly, just to kind of set the stage here. Special events and grants are the keys to success. Well, there's certainly potentially 2 keys, but they're certainly not the sum total, right? Special events, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation, is certainly one strategy. However, it does have its limitations. It does require plenty of labor and plenty of resources that oftentimes our smaller organizations and nonprofits don't have the luxury to bring forward. And so while certainly we have heard, you know, in our communities of special events that have been successful, that certainly is one element, but not the sum total. Grants certainly are a big part of, again, for many of our smaller organizations, that's sometimes the way that they establish kind of their core practice, right, and kind of their infrastructure is to connect with those foundations, philanthropy, you know, through grants and contracts with government, local government organizations. But again, I think there are certainly some limitations to either one of these that we'll go through in a little bit. New contributors are the key to success. We certainly want new contributors, but I'm going to make an argument for the fact that we need new, but then we also need to cultivate and nurture our existing contributors, and how do we sort of move them up the ladder of contributions, if you will. And so that could certainly be true, but again, that it's not the sum total, and certainly one key to success. A development director, oh boy, right? Some of our organizations have the luxury of sort of having somebody who is there paying attention to how do we sort of, you know, do the cultivation work that's needed, the research, et cetera. I would say for majority or many of us, we don't have this luxury. And certainly even the development director will need to sort of work at multiple levels to engage the multitude of the organization and their community constituencies to essentially, again, cultivate and nurture those relationships in order to get those resources in. And so it's not just about having a development director, it's really about some of the other elements that Joan talked to us about earlier in terms of engaging and doing the necessary planning and having data, right, in order to bring in the resources needed. And then finally, fundraising success is measured in dollars. Well, again, you know, as we opened up this conversation, it's not necessarily about dollars. It's about how many people we can sort of build those connections with around our mission, around the work that we do, enough that they can see the added value, right, that the work that we do in our organization is going to bring into the community and the outcomes that are produced. And so I would say that some of these, it's not necessarily that they're false, but they certainly are not the sole key to success. So how's that for to get the conversation started here. So thank you for all of the responses that you contributed. So moving forward, because fundraising and raising funds is not necessarily just about bringing the money in, why do, right, people give in the first place? And I think there's a fundamental kind of assumption that all of us who are in nonprofit and community benefit work have really struggled with and been challenged with is really developing and embarking on a mission that really does drive the funding, right? So it's really mission first, funding comes after. So the beliefs, the set of values, the principles that you operate with are really the strongest reasons for why our communities and our donor public give in the way that they do. And so your mission is really what should be driving the kinds of fundraising that you do and how you go about doing it. So the mission being the guiding principle behind all of your activities. And it's really an opportunity to basically let the world know what you do, right, how you do it, why you do what you do, and for whom. Who is sort of the beneficiaries of the work that you do as an organization. And certainly we want to make sure that our mission is embraced at all levels of the organization, no matter if it's, certainly the volunteers that come and who want to contribute their time and their energy to the work that you do, all the way up to the board of directors and those who are guiding the policies and the operations, if you will, for the organization. So again, I think a good reminder for all of us that we cannot and absolutely must not lose sight of our mission and the values that we hold. So that finally the goal of fundraising is to really provide a way for the organization to manage and grow a sustainable and diversified portfolio of resources. So those resources, again, should be advancing the values and mission and the success of our cause and the work. And to cultivate contributing relationships to form a dynamic community of support. So what we're trying to do is bring as many people, right, and communities as possible to form this circle of support. And some of those we want to sort of move up potentially from volunteering their time to potentially a point where they feel like they can, give financially to the organization based on the positive experiences they've had as part of their volunteer work. So as we, just like Joan sort of took us through some of the essential steps for sustainability planning, we might think similarly in terms of the work around fund development and some of the both pre, during, and post activities that we need to have in place in order to be successful in any fundraising effort. And this planning process, if you will, or operational process is how we call sort of ROPES. And ROPES stands for a number of things. R being kind of the piece around research. So what do we mean by research? Here, in terms of research around fundraising, is that we want to be able to sort of keep our eyes and ears open to identify some, what are the opportunities out there, knowing a little bit about kind of what the lay of the land is in terms of how people are giving, what people are giving to, right? What are some of the emerging trends or issues that are bubbling up, and do those issues and efforts align with our organizational values? So that's a little bit about kind of landscape and kind of fielding, looking at the field generally to see if there are some opportunities emerging or currently existing. The other is sort of knowing kind of capacity, right? So in this case, it could be capacity around different donor publics about what their capacity is for giving. And so if you have local groups who are, there seems to be, for instance, a lot of interest around, young people's education, and there seems to be a lot of kind of groundswell, right, around organizing around this and engaging in kind of local organizing around that particular issue. We know generally that there are people then who would be willing to kind of invest, right, in some of that, in that body of work, and understanding kind of their capacity to give and doing some of that research is important. And then finally, the idea around researching what the match is, right? So if there are opportunities to kind of leverage existing resources financially, we consider sort of looking at some of those opportunities as they come forward. So research and doing that kind of the homework, if you will, is important. Another element, the O of ROPES, is to kind of think about organizing for the donor public. So again, preparing internally, again, having some of those systems in place so that we recognize who are current donors. If we don't have donors currently, right, what are sort of the systems to make sure that we understand and communicate with those potential donors? So there are certainly things that we need to be prepared to do and to put into place internally. So this organizing piece is kind of internally setting the systems and setting the tools and the framework in order to then receive donations and funds. Another part of the is sort of the output, how much time do we need to be thinking about in terms of developing or implementing a fundraising plan? What's our capacity and sort of alternatives? So if we have full board commitment behind, a fundraising plan, we might have a greater capacity for doing some different kinds of fundraising, right, options and activities, as opposed to if we're still trying to convince the board that that this is a thing that they need to be involved with. And so the variations in that, we need to spend time to really kind of look at, right, and look internally about our own capacity and sort of if we can't do the big plan, what are some short-term steps that we can take? And so considering kind of those alternatives would be very important for us. The P for planning and program, many of you probably have heard things around like the idea behind a gift pyramid. So we need to be thinking about, well, what kind of fundraising program do we want to embark in? So a typical kind of gift pyramid, if you think about a traditional pyramid, the base of it being sort of what I might describe every other occasion donors, right? Every now and then. We might hear from them. We might get a few, some level of contributions from them, but it's not consistent. So if we go up the pyramid from that base, which may be the biggest part, right, of the pyramid for our organization, we begin to sort of think about how do we move that occasional donor up to more of a consistent recurring donor, right, or funder. And so that idea around kind of moving up the pyramid, getting people to move up the gift ladder, if you will, is certainly something that we might want to consider. And for every organization, that pyramid or that gift ladder kind of looks differently, right, depending on what it is that you want to accomplish. So, and then the other elements around planning and program is that what do we need to be doing in terms of actually operationalizing this fundraising plan? So the implementation of it, how do we actually cultivate and nurture existing as well as new? How do we solicit, sort of engage new funders and donors in the process? So these are important kind of considerations that we need to be thinking about even before we even launch into the implementation process. And then finally, evaluation, of course, just as in any program, we want to make sure that we're checking in on how are we doing, right? What's the process that we kind of put into place around our fundraising? What is it looking like now that we're 3 months into it, 6 months into it? And how are we sort of assessing what our success is? How do we refine it, and what's our measurement to make sure that we are moving the needle in the way that we need to? Or in some cases, we might need to switch gears and make some tweaks and changes along the way. So evaluation of our fundraising and fund development efforts is critical. And then stewardship, I think oftentimes, if we think about this fund development work as being kind of a circular process, right, and it reinforces itself. So the idea around stewardship is that, one, reciprocity is important. We want folks to give in return for something that we're giving, right, in terms of the outcomes that we're producing, the added value, the contribution to community health, whatever that might be for your organization. This is a reciprocal, right, a mutually beneficial process. So stewardship is sort of important to really be thinking about how are we making sure that everybody is benefiting this, right? We're certainly benefiting from the funds that are coming into the organization, but in response, what are we doing with those funds? And then responsible gift reporting, obviously this is really key for us to have the systems in place. This is in terms of good stewardship of any, any funds that come into our organizations, how we make sure that the donor public immediately kind of understands and sort of knows what kind of gifts, if you will, or funding the organization has received, how do we communicate that to folks, right? Because that's the due diligence that our organizations need to make in order to continue getting the consistency of support that we're looking for. And then finally, relationship nurturing. Again, it's important to do things like when we think about stewardship, it's things around, making sure that we do immediate follow-up and thank yous, to acknowledge the contributions of our donors and our funders, and how to maintain that communication. So the relationships being extremely key to this process. So that's sort of the, just in terms of, the idea around ropes and how we can potentially kind of think about from beginning to end. When we think about typical sources of funding, these will look very familiar to many of us, I'm sure. You probably, in terms of a diversified portfolio, the next slide will show a little bit more about that. But, as we know, typical sources of funding come from, private philanthropy, foundations in the form of grants. Perhaps there's some in-kind sponsorships, et cetera. Those can be very, very typical. Corporations, as we know, they also give out grants. They have in-kind. They also provide volunteers if there's some special knowledge that they can bring. They have folks who are willing to offer, their staff and their employees who sign up to serve as volunteers for different issues and events. And then certainly in terms of, their marketing and sponsorship opportunities. And then I just wanted to make mention of the idea around community benefit. There are more and more, particularly in terms of our healthcare organizations, more and more attention is being paid to sort of what's the community benefit that they, again, thinking about reciprocity, the idea of what are they contributing to the community at the same time they're receiving, funds, if you will, to operate their healthcare facilities and providers and service provision. And so this is certainly an area that, for instance, the Kaisers of the world, there's a lot of work being done around community benefit structures and how nonprofits and community-based organizations can potentially tap into this. Government agencies, certainly in terms of grants and contracts, this is probably something that many of us are familiar with, either it be, local government, the state government, County Department of Public Health, healthcare services, any number of sort of government agencies that are looking to partner and to extend, if you will, their capacity to provide opportunities and services and supports in working in conjunction with community-based organizations. And then finally, individual gifts. So there's any number of ways, right, that we can consider, how do we kind of approach folks to do individual giving, and there are, these are some mentions of that, but we're going to go a little deeper into this notion of individual gifts in just a moment here. But I did mention earlier that this is sort of a typical, if you will, if we think about a diversified funding portfolio, this is something that for many of us we want to kind of aspire to if we're not there already. An example of an income or gift table, if you will, plan. These are some tried and true, typically what I think the work is looking for is we want to be looking at our fundraising plan to incorporate, 40% of our funding comes from individual gifts. Typically, 10% or so, maybe from, businesses, corporations, 20% from foundations, 10% from, we earlier just mentioned kind of the special events and activities that our organization may do, and then finally 20% from grants, contracts, and, obviously there's some interrelationships between these. But this is a very typical kind of diversified portfolio, if you will, that, again, if we're not quite there yet, this will help us really kind of set us into a good solid ground, if you will. So just to kind of dive into this piece around individual donors and what do we want to consider when we think about, cultivating or nurturing individual donors and what they might want to contribute to the work. And so there's been a lot of work done in terms of researching, what this kind of process takes, the level of effort, particular strategies and activities that we can do, and we're just going to touch on some of those areas. So, in many of our nonprofits, particularly I think those that are based in communities of color, start off very much through kind of setting their infrastructure and so forth through government contracts and sort of foundation grants oftentimes. That's not to say that, all of them are, but in many cases this is true, and that these grants kind of tend to be sort of smaller in numbers and size when compared to non-minority focused nonprofits. And so because of this, there's been several organizations that have been doing a lot of work around this idea of grassroots fundraising and why this is an important addition to that diversified portfolio and fund development planning that we talked about earlier. So when we think about grassroots fundraising, this is a particular kind of donor development strategy that sort of looks at and considers the communities, right, the very communities that your organization's, my organization's mission is really concerned with. So it's sort of if we think about the constituencies that we serve, it starts from within and it involves kind of the folks who have a stake in the success of the organization's mission. So you can say that there's a lot of people, right, who we hope would have an important stake in our success. But in this case, oftentimes, particularly for grassroots fundraising and communities of color, this really does build on sort of what we might describe as cultural traditions of, mutual aid, the idea around giving back, the idea of sort of the reciprocal nature and honor that's bestowed to both the giver and the receiver. And so some of these elements we're really trying to sort of, showcase and heighten our sensitivities around what does that really mean, right, in terms of the practice around mutual aid, and how do we sort of build on those concepts and practices for the sake of making sure, we sort of consider those as part of the organization's sustainability. So there's, as I mentioned, some really great organizations and communities that are really implementing what we're calling grassroots fundraising strategies. And I want to just sort of give a shout out to Kim Klein and Stephanie Roth with the Grassroots Fundraising Academy, if you will, that has done a lot of work around this, working with local communities of color, to really identify some of the specific kind of activities, if you will, or fundraising strategies that seem to stick, that seem to sort of resonate. And what we've done here is to pull out some of those strategies and in a few kind of bullet points sort of talk a little bit about how are these helpful and useful, when you might consider using them, and sort of success rate, if you will. And so the first one here on this slide kind of outlines the personal face-to-face. There is something to be said, certainly in terms of fundraising efforts, that first face-to-face kind of interaction in many cases nets a far greater return, if you will, and particularly with communities of color, that in some of Kim and Stephanie's research, indicates that those organizations to kind of engage in this process are 50% successful. 50% say yes, with those giving less than what was asked for. So even though they're maybe giving a little less, we have higher success rate at about 50% when we kind of take this on. And it's oftentimes best used to kind of upgrade, if you will, using those terms, donors. So if they're an occasional donor, if you set up some time to kind of meet face-to-face with them, have that dialogue, that they tend to sort of move themselves from an occasional to maybe a recurrent, or with more dollars. So this is an opportunity to raise bigger monies, if you will, in a quicker way. And also important with this particular activity to start with people you know at their level of giving. So you don't want to, start with a recurring if you have a face-to-face with someone who just gives occasionally, who gives, let's say, $50, during your annual campaign, and then start asking them for, $5,000. You don't want to do that. So again, as we talked about earlier, understanding, right, the level of giving. Start with people, start with where they're at, and then sort of move them with your compelling case, right, up the pyramid. And then personal phone calls. So for those you can't get a face-to-face with, the second runner-up, if you will, is the personal phone call. So 20 to 25% success rate. Again, best used to upgrade donors to a higher gift. And potentially used with major donors who can't be visited easily, so or don't want kind of a face-to-face. So this is again another strategy to consider. And I know personally, when I get the phone call from the board of directors, member of the board of directors, from CPEN, I'll just call them out for a minute, I am much more apt to contribute, and actually at a higher amount. So personal experience, I know that works. And then personal letter or email. So as you can see, the common denominator here is that personal touch, right? The phone call from the board of directors to, their colleague. The letter that's maybe handwritten if possible, right, to the board member or to the volunteer. So this is a very kind of low-key way for board and volunteers to ask their friends, colleagues, prospects who are known personally. So this is not a cold call. That's the difference here. This is a personal letter to someone that you know. And oftentimes, this has the benefit of renewing gifts from known donors, so kind of, again, moving the occasional to the recurring. And then it's much more apt to be successful if you actually follow it up with a phone call or even an in-person contact. And then these are these remaining kind of 3 strategies in order, I guess, of success rate. The next one is sort of door-to-door canvas, as you can see here in terms of some of the ways that you might want to engage in this particular activity. This is obviously does take some, human resources to be able to do, and the time to do this. And it is especially helpful or successful if this is sort of used in combination, for instance, with perhaps an organizing drive around a particular issue. So you can kind of, do 2 things at the same time. So that, this particular activity has about 10 to 15% success rate, and followed by what they call kind of phone-a-thons. Probably all of us are familiar with, for instance, NPR and, the local public radio stations that do a lot of and utilize this method in a lot of cases, and works to bring in large numbers of small to medium-sized kind of donations. And then finally, the more informal direct mail, email to cultivate or to bring in new prospects or new donors. And, some of the concerns around this obviously would be things around, resources for postage, the technology that's involved. So these are just some examples of grassroots fundraising that if you haven't already employed or thinking about using, gives just a quick and dirty kind of assessment of considerations of when you might want to use them and why. And then again, this is just a quick slide on, just a quick word about special events, because I think oftentimes people do think about, well, let's just hold, an event so that we bring lots of people to the table and, to sustain our efforts. And in some cases, this is true, but there are certainly limitations. And so some of the success kind of varies by the event, and there are probably some other goals that get embedded in addition to financial goals, where an event can certainly introduce you to new people, gain more publicity and sort of awareness about your organization and your work, and then also to build a sense of community within the organization and attract more people and attention. But at the same time, it's also important to recognize that these events, do take a lot of time and a lot of labor and human resources and certainly a lot of planning. So while they may be successful, and certainly some organizations have used this with high success rate, it's important to sort of know what the caveats are. And just as a last bullet here, even if it's not a big event, maybe considering sort of house parties are certainly a good variation, of something that's much bigger than maybe you work towards. So as, for those of us who are old enough to know who Mae West is, 1 and 1 equals 3 if you do your math right. So this is the idea that, if we do our research and all of our cultivation and relationship building correctly and appropriately, and we're thinking beyond the dollars, that $1 could mean 3. And so some of the recognition and sort of reminders about some of the fundraising challenges and oftentimes that we get into, certainly in terms of lack of time. If we're not prepared, if we haven't built in the time, to build in the infrastructure, right, around what kind of community base do we need to create, right, to recognize and thank our donors afterwards? Do we need a website? All of those infrastructure issues need to be played out. Oftentimes we run into challenges where maybe we don't yet have enough donor prospects, so we need to kind of go back and sort of think about how do we get, right, and increase those prospects. Just as we need to be thinking about the who for sustainability planning, we need to be thinking about the who for, to develop an effective fundraising team. So some of the concerns that oftentimes we run into is that we don't have ready to, kind of recruit onto a fundraising team because either they feel like they're not, they don't have the capacity to do so, nor the time, et cetera. And then sometimes, again, there's lack of training, right, certainly in terms of staff, but also for, our EDs as well as our board members. So just a quick note about kind of, because this came up around the board's role, certainly in terms of sustainability planning, but we also want to be thinking in conjunction with that is the board's role and expectations around fund development. And so typically, right, there is an expectation that the board will play some role in fundraising. And really the operative word here is to really engage them from the very beginning. So how do we engage them actually in developing the fundraising plan in addition to implementation? So oftentimes we might want to be thinking about what's described as a board fundraising policy, right, that can articulate kind of specific expectations, such as the amount that board members are expected to give or raise. If they're looking to waive that requirement, how does that happen, and the range of ways in which they can support fundraising. And so I wanted to just sort of offer an example of a board member fundraising policy, which we will get to you all in addition to the slides post this afternoon. But this is just a quick and dirty example, something that you can certainly adapt in response to your own organization's needs. But as you can see here, there's any number of ways and activities that the board can take on, right? In this case, it's the amount of personal giving that they might engage in and be willing to commit, and/or attending fundraising events, helping to organize fundraising events and activities. So there's, again, these are some options that your organization can adapt and build, but it's, again, an important sort of element of ensuring that the board is fully on board with resource building and leveraging of resources for the organization. Again, these are just some examples of ways to involve your board, from selling tickets to an annual dinner or event, right? I know I just got some tickets that I have to end up selling, and so how do we empower and make sure that the board kind of understands that that's part of their role to potentially, this is certainly one of the things that is important around, if the ED, for instance, is meeting with a potential donor, a major, donor organization or a funder, is there a possibility of a board accompanying the ED to those key conversations and face-to-face meetings? So these, again, likely your organizations are either already doing or maybe considering doing. And then a word on sort of who's on your fundraising team. These are just some examples of sort of roles, right? The idea around we need kind of some leadership in this process. We need ambassadors. We need people who are willing to sort of tell the world, right, about this work that we're doing. And so potentially the board of directors can play a role as serving in this capacity as the ambassadors. And they lead by example, certainly through their board fundraising policies, et cetera, and expectations. There's also kind of the strategists, right? There's a fundraising committee that could be convened that recommend strategies, that helps to kind of ensure that there's collective accountability to the fundraising plan and how we evaluate it. And then finally, the ED of the organization potentially serving as kind of the problem solver, if you will. They certainly model a culture of fundraising and fund development and sustainability for others in the organization, and they can help along with the board of directors and others to ensure that there's adequate resources to support to be able to move forward. So hopefully within, as you begin to sort of assemble your sustainability plan and thinking specifically about who needs to be engaged in fund development, that some of this, that you're considering some of these roles. And then finally, thanks to the Association for Fundraising Professionals, I think there's some, as we mentioned earlier, asking for money is really hard, right? Can be difficult for some of us. And so a quick wisdom on kind of, the ask, if you will. Developing things around like developing an agenda for when you are going to have a solicitation meeting. Making sure that, you decide on what the key messages are from your case statement. Think about the questions that you might anticipate coming from those that you're meeting with or those that you're trying to develop relationships with, and of course come up with what some of those answers might be. This is a key one, always have a lead behind. I know that when, for instance, I met with the Clorox Corporation for a program that we were trying to kind of solicit their work behind. Was, we certainly had our brochures and so forth as part of the lead behind, but I happened to also have a little giveaway at our WHL Women's Health Leadership Program pins, and so, I left behind something like that so that they can immediately sort of remember, right, that conversation has something tangible. So a leave behind can be certainly a number of different things, but the idea is that they don't forget you. And then requesting a specific dollar amount is very important, so not to make it kind of open-ended because, frankly, you don't want to leave it up to them, right, if there's a specific dollar amount or ask, make sure that you ask for it. Get the commitment in writing, be prepared to discuss, and that could be something that, you cultivate as part of your gift pyramid, but the idea around a deferred or a planned gift, certainly something that we're all hoping to kind of strive for. And then finally have a follow-up plan done as soon as the meeting is over. So what's your follow-up? Is there a thank you letter that gets sent? Do you follow up your verbal ask with something in writing? Whatever that follow-up is, make sure that you have it in place and that you implement it. For the hockey fans amongst us, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. So meaning that if you don't ask, you won't ever know, and you might not get. And so it's important to make that ask. And again, as part of our ROPES, assessment, evaluation is key. How are you doing on your fundraising objectives? How effective has those strategies been in moving towards your objectives? What changes can you make to improve the efficiency and reach of your efforts? So just as any good evaluation of programs, it's important to do the same or similar with your fund development. And then finally, the golden rule of fundraising. So successful fundraising results when the right person asks the right person for the right amount, for the right reasons, at the right time. So this is really about kind of targeted asks and making sure that you have, sort of that personal one-on-one is very key. And then finally, just to kind of wrap this piece up with some additional resources, certainly these are organizations that have done a lot of work around fund development and a lot of tools in addition to Jonah's organization and ours. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Joan to wrap up our last piece.
Okay. So in the 10-step process, we have gone through, between the training and today, the first 5 steps. As we talked about, step 6 is where you actually do the decision-making process. All these are, by the way, in the toolkit, which we have as a reference. And then step 7 is creating the options for maintaining your priority efforts. So you've made the decisions, now you need the options. The first part of that is to develop a current funding matrix. Most of you had said that responded to the SurveyMonkey said you had done that. And I believe we gave you that form as part of the training or as the follow-up. And so now what we're talking about is what goes into the justification for continued support. So a lot of these tools within the toolkit are really processes that roll up, each one incrementally to the next phase and the next step. So in the justification for continued support, you're looking for 3 components or 3 sections. There's the list, which is the effort that you want to continue, and the health benefit or the community benefit that's to be sustained. Then there's a section on justification, which provides the results, talks about to whom this effort is important, and what cost effectiveness or other financial justification you can document. I mean, if you have metrics that allow you to do a return on investment, that is clearly the gold standard. Sometimes we don't have that, especially around programs that are labor intensive. When you start really trying to calculate the labor input into things, it can get extremely complicated. But you might know, for instance, you got a grant for X and you were able to document Y result in the community, you can at least say, for a grant of X, we had a savings of Y. And those are important data. So this is really a structured process which can then roll up to sort of a more cogent narrative. But it's like all of the things we learned in grade school and our professional training, you know, having an outline, having a skeleton really helps you roll up into something that is important and conveys your story. If you try to just start writing the story without these elements, ultimately it will bog down. So it also helps you identify the gaps in the process. So, and the reason I'm walking through this is this graph, that the actual table of matrix is going to be very busy. So I took it in a sort of stages here. So then the next area, which would be sort of on the far right, are the resource areas, identifying what is needed, what are the possible sources, and what are the strategies for future sustainability. So it becomes a worksheet that can help you translate both the decision-making process and then the financial discussion into a case for support. And it's kind of in a way where society has come, and I think this is even pre where we are now with infographics and data viz and all these things that can be far more powerful than this matrix. But this is a place to start, and maybe someone really creative can help you with the more snazzy, real-time, current way to describe these things. So here is our example that we talked about earlier in terms of the collaborative. So the effort that's essential to continue is the garden and teaching the high school students applied biology, nutrition, leadership, and business skills. Well, what results have they achieved? Well, they found that the academic performance was high, and they had a 30% higher class attendance rate versus the traditional classes. Who this is important to, and this leads to what Connie was just talking about. When you start to enumerate who cares about and who benefits from this, it leads you to those funding pathways. So the administration cares, the students care, the community as a whole cares, and certainly local government cares. In terms of cost effectiveness, they were able to increase or just effectiveness overall, access to affordable fresh produce, and that the ROP classes cost 20% less than a traditional class. And in the far right, your resource ideas. What's the total? How is that broken down in terms of business development, in terms of operational costs, and obviously human resources always being one of the more costly areas. So this is just a continuation. Because that slide was so busy, we did a second one to kind of split it up. So the health benefits you're trying to sustain are greater school attendance, greater student leadership capacity, and to contribute to the local economy over time. And the possible sources of resources include the regional occupational program, private foundations, a small business administration, and public-private donations. So when you start to get this grid, you can start to see where you're doing particularly well, where you need more data, where you need to shore up different elements of your program, and it allows you then to compose the narrative, or you could even, if you had the luxury of having a writer to help you with this, having had the group go through the machinations to create this document, then someone could help you with the prose, if you will. So I think the important thing is that you say to yourself, and you're able to answer the question, who buys this service? Okay, so it's not just the program or the service recipients, but who benefits when we succeed, and how do we help them continue, how do we get them to help continue our efforts? So in one example, and this is another one that we, informed the toolkits very early initiation and inception, if you will. A group discovered that there were a lot of children that had frequent preventable visits to the hospital emergency room, otherwise known sometimes as frequent flyers. related to asthma and respiratory and other chronic conditions. And so to reduce this, a number of partners worked together and they implemented a case management pilot program for these children, which involved a psychologist, a social worker, and a pharmacist. And the group was fortunate to have garnered very strong commitments and enthusiasm from a number of institutional stakeholders, including the local health department, the school district, the hospital, and Head Start. So instead of approaching a group or an organization and saying, you should do this, which is usually not all that well received, they said, let us help you try this together. And they made sure that they collected data that could show both effectiveness and cost savings. And after seeing that a pilot effort improved the health of children and also saved money, the local medical group adopted and expanded the pediatric case management program. And I was just having a conversation yesterday with someone who's on the board of one of the country's largest nonprofits, and she said that everything they do pilot first. So I think that's a really good strategy as you're thinking about new opportunities or tweaking an existing program that you have. So I've listed some resources as well. The first one is a little old, but it's kind of considered one of the sentinel and seminal pieces in the toolbox. This Shediac and Rizkallah article really helps expand people's thinking about sustainability, so would be one to really think about getting and reviewing. The other is one that's just not hot off the press, but the other extreme, very recent. The entire issue, I think, pretty much, of the most recent nonprofit quarterly, Births and Deaths in the Nonprofit Sector, has a number of articles, some written kind of tongue-in-cheek, so it's kind of there's some interesting reads in there. And then CDC consulted with us to develop their planning guide for sustainability and used some of the tools that we have, but created some of their own as well. And that's available, I believe, in public document domain. And then our toolkit is listed, and certainly invite you to think about ordering that. So with that, we want to acknowledge our support for this webinar and this entire series from the California Wellness Foundation. It's been a delight to get to know all of you in person when we had the training, and we hope that this sort of add-on, which allowed us to go more deeply into some content areas that you were dealing and working through, has been helpful. So both of our websites have lots of information on sustainability and other capacity building tools. So I hand it back to Connie to moderate any questions we might have, I guess.
Great. So I'm going to invite folks to, we have a few minutes that we can invite some questions, and as you all, and I'd go ahead and just type those into your in the chat box, and both Joan and I will try and respond to those. In the meantime, if you do have any questions or want to contact us after today's webinar, you can reach us as shown on this particular slide, both Joan and myself. We have our emails here listed, and also in terms of our website. And again, we certainly appreciate all of you participating, engaging with us this afternoon, and appreciate the California Wellness Foundation for their support. So I'm going to see if there's any questions that come in that you all would like to kind of put on the table for us to think about and consider. And while you're maybe doing that, I did want to just bring forward, Joe mentioned the SurveyMonkey, which maybe all of you or many of you on the line today might have responded to, but there were a couple of questions that came through, or issues that people asked about from that SurveyMonkey, and one of them had to do with both a commentary as well as maybe, gee, I wish, this were sort of a different environment, and that has to do with the idea around navigating different funding politics, if you will. So kind of how do we get beyond sort of the good old boy politics and then specifically in terms of the lack of value for community-driven practices, which may or may not be on the mainstream, and which will require kind of different levels and sort of distribution of resources. So I guess one thought in terms of responding to this idea around sort of funding politics, if you will, is that oftentimes if we are just maybe a new organization coming on board who have yet the social capital, we're trying to build our social capital, what are some of the ways that we can kind of draw attention? And some of the things that I know our organization have done and also have worked with others to do is, the idea around joining local coalitions or collaboratives, right, that are convening around some of the issues that you care about. And in those coalition efforts, we're one of several different perspectives and contributors to the conversation and the good thinking, right, that comes from communities. And so oftentimes that kind of leads us into other venues and other connections and helps us kind of build and expand our relationships. The other is that, particularly, for instance, with the implementation, let's just use the Affordable Care Act right now. There's a lot of attention and work being done locally. We know that there needs to be a lot of kind of tailored approaches, right, to get people enrolled, et cetera, as well as certainly utilizing their newly enrolled status. What we have seen, certainly here in Sacramento County and elsewhere, is that local policymakers are sort of paying attention such that they're championing local strategies for getting people being a part of those implementation and outreach and enrollment efforts of ACA. And so it might be of interest to the your local policymakers, let's say your local representative or your city council, et cetera, to talk about and engage them in some conversations around what you're doing and if what you're doing or how what you're doing really they should care and in ways that perhaps they can engage you as new policies get implemented and new strategies get on the ground. So that might be another opportunity. And then, as we know, there are also lots of other local planning efforts. So in the field of education, we know that the newly installed kind of local control funding formula, there's some mandates around community advisory boards and input into that process of developing and figuring out what the school district needs to do in terms of distribution of education resources and funding. And so if you work on that field and you're wanting to sort of, get integrated into the mainstream conversation, I think becoming a part of some of those stakeholder meetings and town forums that I know are happening right now for many school districts and schools, that's another way to sort of get your thoughts and your ideas into the planning process. So those are some examples of ways in response to that particular question. I don't see any other questions at this point in time. So given that we are at our time now, we wanted to, again, thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Please feel free to contact us after this webinar. You will be receiving a link for both the recording as well as the presentation slides and the evaluation survey that we hope you'll all complete and help us inform future efforts. Thank you all so very much and have a wonderful rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.